There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a crowd when they're about to watch something go wrong. Not the polite quiet of anticipation, not the held breath hush before a jump or a race. This is the kind where men stop chewing their tobacco, where women grip the fence rail without knowing they've done it, where even the horses in the far paddock seem to turn their heads as if some frequency only animals can hear has shifted in the air. I've been a record keeper most of my life, not by profession, by compulsion. I carry a small leather journal in my breast pocket, always have, worn smooth at the spine from years of being pulled out and pushed back in during moments exactly like this one. My wife used to call it my evidence book. She meant it affectionately. Mostly, what I'm about to tell you, I wrote down in that journal the evening it happened, while my hand was still unsteady and the light was failing fast over the Cimarron Range. I wrote it because I knew that if I didn't, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering if I'd imagined it. I hadn't. I was standing at the fence of Harlo Dean's ranch, a man whose name you'd know if you'd spent more than a week in this county, on a Thursday afternoon in late October when the sky was the color of an old bruise and the wind had teeth in it. I was there on routine business, ledger reconciliation, feed invoices, the kind of work that puts you in the right place at the wrong time, or maybe the right time, depending on how you measure things. What I witnessed that afternoon took me 3 attempts to write down correctly, not because the events were complicated. They weren't. A horse, a man, a crowd that didn't believe in him. But some things that happen in plain daylight still feel like they belong in the category of dreams, the kind that leave a mark on your chest when you wake. This is what I saw. This is what I recorded. Harlo Dean had a horse named Diablo Rojo, and he kept him the way some men keep their worst memories, locked away, occasionally referenced in conversation to remind people of their own smallness, never quite willing to let go. The horse was a red roan stallion, 16 hands at the withers, and the color of him in afternoon light was something between rust and dried blood. He'd been at the Dean Ranch for 3 years by the time I'm talking about, acquired in a trade from a stock dealer out of New Mexico who'd offloaded him with the kind of speed and forced casualness that should have told Harlo everything he needed to know. Diablo Rojo had broken a wrangler's collarbone in Taos, had fractured 2 ribs on a handler in Santa Fe, had been worked by 4 different horse trainers, men with reputations, men who'd gentled Mustangs and reformed cutters and coaxed quarter horses through grief and trauma, and every single one of them had walked away from the Red Roan with some version of the same assessment. He's not mean, he's decided. That was the phrase I heard most often, repeated around Harlo's supper table and his fence line and his card games the way certain stories get repeated in small communities, not because they explain anything, but because they feel like an explanation. He's not mean. He's decided. As if the horse had sat down one day with all the information available to him and arrived at a conclusion about human beings that he saw no reason to revisit. I believed it. I'd seen Diablo Rojo from a distance. I'd watched him move across the eastern pasture alone, the other horses giving him a wide, instinctive berth, and there was something in the quality of his stillness that didn't feel like animal vacancy. It felt like assessment, like patience with a purpose. Harlo Dean, for his part, kept the horse because Harlo Dean kept everything that had cost him money. It was a founding principle of the man. He was 61 years old, built like a man who had once been made of hard work and had since been padded by its profits, with a white mustache he kept trimmed and a way of standing at the center of any group that suggested he'd been rehearsing authority since childhood. He owned 1,200 acres along the Cimarron, ran 300 head of cattle, employed 9 full-time hands, and had a particular gift for turning generosity into theater. That's the thing I always noted about Harlo in my ledger, not the financial kind, but the other one I keep in my head about people. Harlo's kindnesses always had an audience. They were gestures staged for effect, genuine enough in their material outcome, but structured so that the giver's goodness was the main event, the recipient a kind of prop in a morality play whose author and director happened to be the same man. I say all of this not to condemn him. I've known worse men. And what happened that October didn't reveal Harlo Dean to be a villain. It revealed him to be something more uncomfortable than that. A man surprised by a world that turned out to be larger than his performance of it. The poor cowboy's name was Ezra Coldwell. I'm going to spend some time on Ezra because the accounts I've heard since, The ones that circulate in town, that get retold at the feed store and the barber shop, tend to flatten him into a symbol, the plucky underdog. The humble man vindicated, and I understand why stories do that, why they sand down the complicated edges to get at something smoother and more portable. But I was there, and I saw Ezra Coldwell whole, and he deserves better than a symbol. He was 34 years old, though he looked 40-something, the way men do when they've spent their 30s outdoors and lean and worried. Medium height, wide through the shoulders, with hands that were visibly oversized for his frame. The hands of a man who'd been doing hard work since before his body finished deciding what it wanted to be. His face was angular and weathered, with a scar along the left jaw from a fence wire incident when he was 19, and he had the particular posture of someone who has spent years being in the way of people who needed him to be somewhere else. He'd come to the Dean Ranch 6 weeks earlier looking for day work. He wasn't local. He drifted in from the Texas Panhandle after a drought season had finished off the small operation he'd been helping manage, a little 300-acre spread outside Amarillo owned by an elderly woman named Mrs. Pruitt who had finally, at 78, agreed to sell and move to her daughter's house in Tulsa. Ezra had been with Mrs. Pruitt for 6 years. He'd kept her cattle alive through 2 dry summers, patched her fences in weather that had no business being worked in, and managed her books with a care that consistently surprised her accountant. When she sold, she gave him 3 months' wages and a handwritten letter of character reference that she'd clearly labored over, the handwriting shaky but the words precise and warm. He'd arrived at the Dean Ranch on a Monday morning in September, letter in hand, hat in his other hand, and Harlo had hired him immediately. Not, I suspect, out of any particular assessment of Ezra's worth, but because he was down 2 hands for the autumn gather and the letter from Mrs. Pruitt had been specific enough to suggest competence. Harlo Dean valued competence the way he valued all tools, instrumentally, conditionally, and with the unspoken assumption that the tool existed for his purposes. Ezra had been working the gather for 6 weeks. He was quiet on the ranch. The other hands said so when I spoke with them later. Not unfriendly, but economical. He kept to himself in the evenings, ate quickly, was in the barn at first light. He had a small, particular habit that 2 of the hands mentioned independently of each other, which was that he hummed when he worked. Not songs exactly, more like the melodic equivalent of thinking out loud. A low, shapeless sound that rose and fell with whatever he was doing. They'd noticed it because it wasn't the kind of humming that was performed. It was private. The kind you do when you've forgotten anyone can hear. He didn't own a horse. That was the practical fact at the center of everything. He'd had a horse, a bay gelding named Cutter he'd worked with for 4 years. But Cutter had come up lame in July, tendon damage that wasn't going to heal to working condition, and Ezra had made the decision quietly and without drama, and had absorbed the loss with the specific, contained grief of a man who has practiced not letting grief grow larger than the container he has available for it. He'd been working borrowed horses since then, whatever the ranch had spare, and the awkwardness of that arrangement. Always on someone else's animal, always slightly behind the rhythm of a horse you haven't had time to learn, was visible to anyone who knew horses well enough to see it. I knew horses well enough to see it. The morning it started, I was in Harlo's office doing the quarterly reconciliation when I heard raised voices from the direction of the east barn. This was unusual. The Dean Ranch ran on a certain controlled formality. Harlo enforced it without having to enforce it, the way some men create atmospheres around themselves that regulate behavior without explicit instruction. Raised voices weren't standard. I set down my pen and went to the window. What I could see from there was partial, the east barn's open face, the paddock attached to it, and beyond that the slanted autumn light cutting long shadows across the dirt. I couldn't hear the words clearly through the glass, only the register, one voice low and steady, one voice that had the particular pitch of public announcement. I put on my coat. I told myself it was for fresh air. By the time I got to the paddock rail, a small audience had assembled. 3 ranch hands I recognized, Wick Navarro, Denny Pruitt, and a young man called Boots whose surname I never caught, plus the ranch's foreman, a heavy-set Comanche man named Garrett Swiftwind who stood slightly apart from the others with his arms crossed, and his face neutral in the way faces get when they're working hard at neutrality. Harlo was in the paddock, and beside him, at the end of a long lead rope, was Diablo Rojo. The horse was dancing, not the light, playful dancing of an animal in good spirits, but the sharp, contained dancing of one working through aggression, testing the weight of restraint. His nostrils were wide. His ears were flat and then forward and then flat again, cycling through threat assessments. Even at the rail, 12 feet away, I could feel the heat of his attention. Ezra Coldwell was on the other side of the fence. The arrangement became clear quickly. Harlo was speaking, not to Ezra exactly, more toward Ezra in the way that men with audiences speak toward rather than to their subject, and the gist of it was this. Harlo had decided to offer Diablo Rojo to any man on the ranch who could ride him. The conditions were simple. If a hand could ride the red roan for a full count, Harlo used the phrase, seat him proper, which was specific enough to mean something to anyone who worked horses, then the horse was his to keep. A gift, outright. No wages deduction, no lease arrangement, his. The offer had been made before I arrived, clearly, because the hands at the rail had the particular posture of men who had already done their mental accounting, and arrived at the conclusion that the horse wasn't worth dying for, however valuable he might otherwise be. Wick Navarro was studying the ground. Denny Prout was chewing on a stem of dried grass with the focused attention of a man who needs something to do with his mouth while he declines. Ezra Coldwell had not declined. That was the part I pieced together from the conversation I caught midstream. Ezra had stepped forward. He had said quietly that he'd like to try. Harlo's expression when I finally got a full look at it was one I recognized from years of watching men in rooms where they hold more power than they strictly need. It was the expression of a man who has set up a situation for one purpose and discovered an unexpected complication. He'd made the offer, I suspected, as theater. A demonstration of the horse's impossibility, perhaps, or simply a public airing of the animal's intractability, which Harlo could then use to justify some decision he'd already made about the horse's future. He hadn't, I was fairly certain, genuinely expected anyone to say yes. And now Ezra Coldwell was saying yes. Harlo recovered quickly. He was practiced at recovery. He gave a small smile, the indulgent kind, the kind that says, well, let's see what happens then, and he gestured toward the gate. He's all yours, Harlo said, and then to the assembled hands as if narrating, let's see what our man from Amarillo can do. Ezra came through the gate slowly. I want to be precise about this, because the slowness mattered. It wasn't the slowness of hesitation. It wasn't a man working himself up to something. It was the slowness of purpose. He moved as though he had all the time that existed, as though the horse and the paddock and the watching men were elements in an environment he was navigating by his own internal compass, and the compass didn't particularly rush. He didn't look at Diablo Rojo directly. That was the first thing I noticed. He came through the gate, and then he stopped. He put his hands at his sides. He looked at the ground just to the left of his boots, and then he tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something below the threshold of what the rest of us could hear. The horse's dancing stopped. Not immediately, there was still movement, still the flicking of weight from haunch to haunch, but the quality of it changed. Diablo Rojo's ears had been flat. Now one rotated forward, just one. The other stayed back monitoring, but that single forward ear was the kind of detail you don't manufacture. That was the horse asking a question. I had my journal out. I don't remember taking it from my pocket. I was writing in the margin of a supply invoice because I hadn't thought to open to a clean page. He's not looking at the horse. Why isn't he looking at the horse? I wrote it as a statement because it didn't feel like a question. It felt like an observation that was trying to become an understanding. Harlo said something, a murmur to Garrett Swiftwind, something low and rhetorical. Swiftwind didn't respond. Ezra took 3 steps toward the horse, then stopped again. The red roan's head came down a fraction, just a fraction, but I saw it. In the margin below my first note, I wrote a single word, deliberate. What happened over the next 20 minutes is something I've tried to describe to several people since, and I've gotten varying degrees of belief, which I've come to understand is less about the facts, and more about what the facts require of the listener. Some things ask something of you before you can accept them. They ask you to expand a little, to make room for something that doesn't fit neatly into what you already know. Ezra Coldwell did not rush the horse. He did not employ tricks. He carried no special equipment beyond his own stillness and a methodical patience that seemed, watching it, almost like a form of language, as if he was speaking to the animal in a dialect made entirely of body and breath and the measured calibration of approach and pause. He circled, not around the horse, not the confrontational circle of a trainer trying to establish dominance, but an oblique circle offset that kept him in the horse's awareness without positioning him as a direct challenge. He let the horse track him. He paused when the horse tensed. He moved when the horse's breathing deepened. He read the animal with the kind of fluency that is not learned in a month or a season. It is built over years, over many horses, over failures and half-successes and slow accumulations of understanding. I knew something about horses, not as much as Ezra clearly, but enough to know what I was watching. I was watching a conversation. The hands at the rail had gone fully quiet. Even Harlo had stopped speaking. The theatrical frame he'd built around this moment, the gift, the audience, the public challenge, had dissolved, and what was left underneath it was something none of us had quite prepared for, genuine attention. The unwilled, unself-conscious kind. The kind that happens when something real is occurring and you simply cannot look away. Diablo Rojo's second ear came forward. I wrote that down, too. I wrote the time, 3:41 in the afternoon, the sun still above the western ridge, but beginning its tilt toward it. Because I had the instinct that this moment would need to be anchored to something specific later, when memory started doing what memory does. Ezra put his hand on the horse's neck at 3:47. The touch was brief, not tentative brief. The difference matters. Tentative is about the person, brief is about the horse. He touched the neck, felt whatever he felt, and drew his hand back without drama. Diablo Rojo did not move away. He stood. Behind me, I heard Wick Navarro exhale. A long, low breath that wasn't quite a word, but contained about as much information as a word could. Ezra reached up and rested his hand on the mane. Not gripping, resting. Then, in a motion so unhurried it seemed almost theoretical, he raised himself alongside the horse's left flank, pressed his chest briefly to the animal's side, and when he felt no recoil, nothing, no explosive departure, no warning, he put his weight into the motion and swung himself up. He seated himself on Diablo Rojo. The horse went still. Not the stillness of suppression. I've seen that, the tense, coiled quiet of an animal absorbing an outrage before releasing it. This was different. This was the stillness of something recognized. As if Diablo Rojo, who had made his assessment of human beings in a Santa Fe arena, or a Taos barn, or some earlier moment no one had been witness to, was encountering now an exception and was, slowly, provisionally, with the full right to revise his conclusion, revising it. I wrote in the margin of the invoice, he seated him. Then I stood at the rail and watched Ezra Coldwell walk the red roan around the paddock in the failing afternoon light. And I did not write anything for a long time, because some things you need to just watch. Harlo Dean was silent for a full minute after Ezra dismounted. I watched his face because I watch faces. It's the other habit, alongside the journal, that makes me useful at my particular kind of work. What moved across Harlo's face in that minute was complicated and not entirely flattering, and I thought, genuinely human in a way his public face rarely was. There was the surprise, which he worked to suppress and didn't entirely manage. There was something that might have been the beginning of respect, or might have been the calculation of what respect, in this situation, would cost him. And there was, underneath all of it, something smaller and more private that I can only describe as a reckoning. The particular expression of a man who has, without quite meaning to, been shown something about the distance between what he believed and what is true. He cleared his throat. Well, he said. And then, because Harlo Dean had been in the business of public performance for 61 years, I'm a man of my word. He looked at Ezra Coldwell across the paddock. Horse is yours, he said. Ezra nodded once. He had his hand on Diablo Rojo's neck again, the same resting touch, no performance in it. Thank you, he said, that was all. I wrote it down. I wrote the time, the light, the direction of the wind. I wrote Harlo's expression as precisely as I could and Ezra's non-expression as precisely as I could, because both of them seemed important in different ways. Then I capped my pen and put the journal away and stood at the fence as the crowd dispersed, each person carrying something slightly different in their chest than what they'd arrived with, something that hadn't been offered to them but had happened anyway, the way the best things do. The sun was well into its descent now, painting the western ridge in colors that had no names that fully worked, and Ezra Coldwell stood in the paddock with a red roan stallion that nobody had been able to ride in 3 years, and the horse stood quietly beside him, and neither of them seemed in any particular hurry to go anywhere. I have tried since to identify what Ezra Coldwell had that the 4 professional trainers hadn't. I'm not certain I've gotten there, but I'll tell you the closest thing I can find to an answer, which I wrote in my journal that evening and have not substantially revised. A week passed before I had reason to return to the Dean Ranch. In that week I heard 3 different versions of what had happened in the paddock, at the feed store, at the barber shop, and once, improbably, from my wife's cousin who had heard it from someone in town who hadn't been there. All 3 versions had the essential facts right, and everything surrounding the facts wrong in the way that stories get when they pass through enough hands that each person, without meaning to, refines them toward something more legible and less strange. The version at the feed store had Diablo Rojo rearing. He hadn't reared. The version from my wife's cousin involved Ezra having some kind of special gift or whispered secret, some technique he'd learned from an Apache elder during his time in the Panhandle. She told me this with the bright-eyed certainty of someone who has received information she finds satisfying. I didn't argue. The truth was less dramatic in its details and more dramatic in its substance, and I've found that most people prefer it the other way around. What I did know, from Garrett Swiftwind, who I'd spoken with briefly at the gate before I left that Thursday, was that Ezra had been in the paddock with Diablo Rojo every morning before dawn since. Every morning, I'd said. Garrett had looked at me with the patient expression of a man who considers most questions slightly beside the point. Before I'm up, he said, which is early. I carried that detail with me through the week. I'm a man who keeps evidence, and that detail felt like evidence of something, though I couldn't say precisely of what, only that it mattered, the way certain things announce their own importance before you've figured out what they mean. When I returned to the ranch on a Thursday, a different Thursday, the light already lower in the sky, the first real cold of October having arrived in the interval, I came early enough that the morning routine was still underway. I parked my truck at the lane and walked in, and the first thing I heard was the humming. It was coming from the east barn, low and shapeless, and the sound of it across the cold morning air had a carrying quality that I hadn't expected. It moved through the still air the way smoke moves, not dramatic, not insistent, but present in a way that was difficult to ignore once you'd noticed it. I stood at the barn entrance and watched without announcing myself, which is a habit I'm not entirely proud of, but have found professionally useful. Ezra was in the stall with Diablo Rojo, not riding, not even attempting to ride. He was standing at the horse's left shoulder, running a brush in long, even strokes along the animal's flank, and he was humming that shapeless melody, and the horse was doing something I had never personally witnessed a horse characterized as violent and unmanageable do. He was leaning into it. Not dramatically, not performing it. Just the faintest yielding pressure, the red roan's weight shifting incrementally toward the brush and the hand holding it. A gesture so small that if you didn't know horses you might miss it entirely, and if you did know horses you would know that it meant something large. I watched for perhaps 3 minutes. Then Ezra looked up, entirely unsurprised by my presence, and nodded. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I said, and then, because I couldn't help it, "How long's that been happening?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. The leaning. "Yes. Day 4, he said, and went back to brushing." I put myself against the barn wall with my hands in my coat pockets and watched, and I did not take out my journal, because some things you should just let exist without immediately turning them into evidence. The problem surfaced that morning, and I was there to see its beginning, though I didn't yet understand what I was seeing. Harlo Dean arrived at the east barn at 8:15. He came the way he usually moved across his own property, with the measured confidence of a man whose footsteps are landing on ground that belongs to him, which lends a particular quality to walking that is very different from how most people move through space. He had 2 men with him. His ranch manager, a thin, efficient Texan named Harold Corbin who handled the business side of operations, and a man I didn't recognize, well-dressed in the specific way of men who don't actually work outdoors but want to suggest familiarity with it, wearing a tan duster that had clearly never seen a fence line. I found out later his name was Fletcher Moody. He was a buyer out of Tulsa, cattle primarily, but with a recent interest in horses, the kind of interest that arises when a man has made more money than he knows what to do with and starts looking for things that have both monetary value and social cachet. A good horse accomplishes both. A famous horse, even famous for the wrong reasons, accomplishes both emphatically. I did not know any of this when Harlo walked into the east barn with Corbin and Moody. What I knew was what I could observe. The quality of Harlo's attention when he saw Ezra in the stall with Diablo Rojo, and the quality of his attention when he looked at the horse, which was a different quality, and the difference was informative. When Harlo looked at Ezra, there was a kind of recalibration happening. I'd seen its beginning the previous Thursday, that private reckoning, and here was a further stage of it. Something that wasn't quite discomfort and wasn't quite guilt and was somewhere in the space between. A man adjusting to new information about the world and not finding the adjustment entirely pleasant. When Harlo looked at the horse, the expression was different. I wrote later that evening trying to name it reappraisal. The look of a man who has donated something and then watched its value increase. He hadn't intended to give Ezra anything worth having. The horse had been a problem, a liability, something he kept out of stubbornness and occasionally deployed in conversation as evidence of his own wild, untamable holdings. And now the horse was something else. Now the horse was leaning into a brush in a way that Harlo's 4 professional trainers had never managed to produce. And there was a man from Tulsa standing at Harlo's elbow, whose attention had sharpened noticeably the moment he'd gotten a full look at Diablo Rojo. "Fine animal," Moody said. He said it carefully, the way buyers say things carefully, landing near the subject without quite touching it, leaving space to retreat if the opening doesn't serve. "He is," Harlo said. There was a pause. "I heard he was a problem horse," Moody said. "He was," Harlo said, another pause. "Found the right hand for him, apparently." The way he said apparently was interesting. I wrote it down. Ezra finished his brushing without rushing it, which I suspected was deliberate but presented as simply natural. He took his time. He moved to the horse's other side. He ran the brush in the same long, even strokes, and the humming continued, and Diablo Rojo continued his faint, ongoing lean, and the effect of all of this on the men watching from the barn entrance was the effect of something being displayed that had not been intended for display. When he finished, Ezra stepped out of the stall and latched it behind him. He nodded at Harlo with the particular deference of a hand acknowledging his employer. Not servile, not warm, exactly right for the context. "He's coming along," Harlo said. It was a statement but shaped like a question. "Yes, sir," Ezra said. "Moody here is interested in seeing what he can do. When you think he'll be ready for a real demonstration." The word demonstration hung in the air. I watched Ezra's face, which did not change in any dramatic way, but something in the stillness of it told me the word had landed and he was working with it. Demonstration meant something different than ride. Demonstration had an audience built into it, and an audience changed the nature of the thing being demonstrated, and Ezra was, I had a strong sense of this now, a man who understood exactly how much audiences changed things. "He's not there yet," Ezra said. "Give him another 2-3 weeks." Harlo smiled the performed smile. "Let's say 10 days. Ezra looked at him for a moment. "Yes, sir," he said. After Harlo and the others left, Ezra stood by the stall a moment. I was still against the barn wall. He didn't look at me, but he knew I was there. "You going to write that down too?" he said. I had already written it. I didn't deny it. "What do you think he wants?" I asked. Ezra was quiet long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Doesn't matter what he wants, matters what the horse needs." He picked up the water bucket. He went back into the stall. The humming resumed. Over the 10 days that followed, I did not witness everything. I have work of my own, accounts that don't reconcile themselves. But I made more visits to the Dean Ranch than strict professional necessity required. I'm not ashamed of it. I was watching something that I had a growing conviction mattered, and the conviction was specific enough that I wanted to be able to report it accurately when the time came. What I observed across those visits was a process that I can only describe as mutual. Ezra was changing the horse, but the horse, I came to believe, was also changing Ezra, or perhaps more precisely, the horse was revealing Ezra, drawing out something that had been there but kept held in tight and close, the way a man keeps things that have been beaten back by circumstance. I watched Ezra move from the brushwork to the groundwork. The long line circling, the pressure and release patterns, the slow establishment of communication through the lead rope. And I watched Diablo Rojo learn, day by day, that instruction from this particular human meant something different than instruction from all the previous humans. Not that it was painless or perfect. There were days the horse backed off. There were days Ezra came out of the paddock moving stiffly, his jaw set, and those days he'd sit at the fence for a while before going back in, not giving up, just waiting for the frustration to metabolize into something more useful. I talked with him on those days when he seemed willing. He didn't talk easily, but he talked honestly, and the honest things he said were the kind that you write down not because they're quotable, but because they're true in a way you want to keep near. He told me about Mrs. Prewitt, about the 6 years on that small Amarillo spread, the droughts, the months when he wasn't sure the operation would survive to the next season. He told me about Cutter, the bay gelding, with the careful, compressed language of a man who has grieved something and doesn't want the grief to expand by talking about it too much. He told me about arriving at Harlo Dean's ranch and understanding immediately, the way you understand things when you've been in enough places and seen enough arrangements of power, exactly what kind of situation he'd walked into and what it required of him. "What did it require?" I asked. He looked at the paddock where Diablo Rojo moved in the low light. "Being useful without being visible," he said. "You know the type of place." I did. I keep the books at 3 such places in this county. "And now," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then now I'm visible." He said it without self-pity and without triumph, just accurately. On the 8th day, he rode Diablo Rojo down the eastern fence line and back. I wasn't there for that. I heard it from Wick Navarro, who had been repairing fence posts 50 yards away and had stopped work entirely and stood with his hammer hanging from his hand watching it happen. "He rode the line," Wick told me the next morning. "All the way down and all the way back. Red Horse didn't so much as twitch wrong." "How did Coldwell look?" I asked. Wick thought about it. "Calm," he said. "Same as always, like it wasn't a thing." "Was it a thing?" Wick looked at me. "I've been working horses for 20 years, he said. "Yeah, it was a thing." I wrote it down that evening. I wrote the day and the distance and Wick's face when he described it. And underneath all of that, I wrote the thing I'd been trying to articulate since the first Thursday, which was this. Ezra Coldwell doesn't perform competence. He's just competent. And that's so rare that when you see it, it looks like something else. It looks like magic. It looks like luck. But it's neither. Then I closed the journal and went to bed and lay in the dark thinking about the demonstration in 2 days' time, and what Harlo Dean wanted from it, and what Ezra Coldwell would give, and whether those were the same thing, and whether it mattered if they weren't. The demonstration was set for a Saturday, which gave it the quality of an event. People came for it who weren't strictly ranch business, which told me Harlo had made some calls. A handful of men from neighboring spreads showed up mid-morning, some with wives. The buyer from Tulsa came in a clean truck with a woman I took to be his wife or secretary and a younger man who had the watchful, calculating look of someone whose professional purpose was to assess and report. Fletcher Moody walked the perimeter of the paddock before anyone else arrived, taking his time with it, measuring things in the particular way that men measure things when they're trying to establish value. He looked at Diablo Rojo in the paddock the way you look at something you want to own, with a kind of covetous appreciation that tries to present itself as neutral appraisal and doesn't quite manage it. I counted 17 people at the paddock rail by 10 o'clock. Garrett Swiftwind was there. All 9 of Harlo's hands were there. Harold Corbin stood at Harlo's right with his ledger out, because Corbin was the kind of man who carried his ledger to social gatherings. I stood at the far end of the rail by the corner post, where I had a full view of both the paddock and the crowd. I had my journal out on top of the rail. I wasn't hiding it. I'd stopped hiding it after Ezra had named it that morning in the barn. Harlo opened the proceedings with a brief speech, naturally. He talked about Diablo Rojo's history in the broad strokes, which allowed for a certain revisionism. In Harlo's telling, keeping the horse all these years was an act of faith, a recognition that the animal had something in him worth finding. The 4 trainers became some of the best horsemen in New Mexico and Texas, which was at least partially true. The broken collarbone and the fractured ribs were not mentioned. He gestured toward the barn. "Ezra Coldwell," he said, with the particular projection of a man introducing an act. Ezra came out of the barn with Diablo Rojo beside him on a loose lead. Not a long line, not a training setup, just the simple lead rope hanging between them with enough slack in it that the horse was choosing to be near him. That detail was not wasted on the people at the rail. I heard it, the shift in the crowd's register, that particular silence I described at the beginning of this account. The chewing stopped, and the grip on the fence rail and the horses in the far paddock turning their heads. The conditions had been met again, exactly as they'd been met 10 days ago, and I understood now that this wasn't coincidence and it wasn't theater. It was recognition. The crowd was recognizing something, even if they couldn't name it. Even if they would have struggled, asked directly, to say what it was they were seeing that produced that quality of attention. They were watching a man and a horse that had come to an agreement, and the agreement was visible, in the slack of the lead rope, in the positioning of Diablo Rojo's ears, in the way the horse moved alongside Ezra's left shoulder with a proximity that was clearly chosen rather than compelled. Ezra brought the horse to the center of the paddock and stopped. He looked around at the crowd once, briefly, not shying from it, just acknowledging it, the way a man acknowledges weather, and then he looked back at the horse. He began to prepare for the saddle. I want to say something here about what I witnessed over the next 8 minutes, because these are the minutes that circulate in the various versions of the story, and in all of them something essential is missing. What's missing is the patience of it. Every version speeds it up, tightens it down to the dramatic beat of the mount. The moment Ezra swings himself up, the moment the horse accepts the weight, the crowd's reaction. But all of those moments only mean what they mean because of the 8 minutes before them. 8 minutes in which Ezra saddled a horse that had fractured 2 people's bones in similar attempts by moving so slowly and speaking so quietly and touching so deliberately that the act of saddling became something else. Not a technique, not a training method, a conversation. The horse communicated through small adjustments. A tension in the barrel, a shift of weight, the direction of an ear, and Ezra received each communication and modified his approach accordingly, not overriding the horse's language with his own agenda, but incorporating it. It was, I thought at the time, and have not thought differently since, the most genuine exchange I had witnessed between a human being and another creature in my entire life. 3 of the people at the rail didn't watch. They were looking at Harlo. I watched Harlo too, for stretches. His public expression was in place, the indulgent, proprietorial smile of a man at an event he has organized. But it was slipping, in the way performances slip when the performer's attention is genuinely captured by the thing they're watching. Harlo was watching Ezra with an expression that had moved past recalibration and into something that didn't have a comfortable name. I thought about what it would feel like to be Harlo Dean in that moment. To have spent 61 years building a certain understanding of how value works, how it distributes, where it lives, in land, in cattle, in the theater of generosity. And then to watch a man with worn-through boots and no horse of his own, and a letter of reference from a 78-year-old woman in Tulsa, demonstrate something that all your money and all your professional trainers and all your years of handling expensive things had never produced. I thought it would feel like being taught something. And I thought that at 61, if you'd spent those years being the teacher, that would feel a certain way. Fletcher Moody had stopped making notes. Ezra mounted at 8 minutes and 14 seconds. I checked my watch. Diablo Rojo accepted the weight. He stood, he breathed. And then he moved. Not explosively, not dramatically. He walked, a clean, easy walk, neck long, back swinging, the walk of an animal that is entirely within itself and at ease there. Ezra sat still on him, weight even, hands quiet, following the motion without directing it, letting the horse establish his own rhythm first. They circled the paddock once. The crowd had not made a sound. On the second circle, Ezra asked for a trot, not with a kick, barely with a leg, some conversation of pressure that I couldn't fully see from the rail, and Diablo Rojo moved into it. Smooth, balanced, his ears forward, his attention clearly on the task rather than on the crowd, the way a horse is when he trusts the situation he's in. On the third circle, Ezra brought him back to a walk, then stopped him in the center of the paddock. He sat for a moment, his hand resting on the horse's neck in that familiar gesture, resting, not gripping. Then he dismounted. The crowd found its voice, not immediately, and not with the explosive enthusiasm of a rodeo crowd. It was more gradual than that, more earned, building from the far end of the rail where Wick Navarro started it with a single slow clap that might have been involuntary, and then Denny Prout, and then others, until it was a proper sound and felt like one. Ezra stood in the center of the paddock with his hand on the horse's neck. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at Harlo. He looked at Diablo Rojo. What happened afterward happened in stages, and I need to tell it accurately because the sequence matters. Fletcher Moody spoke to Harlo Dean within 5 minutes of the demonstration ending. I was close enough to catch portions of it. I'm not ashamed to say I positioned myself deliberately. I heard the words "remarkable animal" and "name a price," and I wouldn't have believed it. I watched Harlo's face during this conversation. The thing I expected to see, and didn't quite, was the calculation. Harlo Dean had spent 61 years calculating, and he was good at it, and I expected to see the quick arithmetic of a man weighing offer against opportunity, buyer's eagerness against his own flexibility. I expected to see the machinery working. What I saw instead was something slower, something that looked like the machinery catching. He glanced toward the paddock, where Ezra had brought Diablo Rojo back to the water trough and was watching him drink. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said to Moody, with something careful in his voice that I'd not heard from him before, "The horse isn't mine to sell." Moody blinked. "I'm sorry." "I gave him away," Harlo said. "Week and a half ago, he belongs to Coldwell." There was a pause in which Moody clearly considered whether this was a negotiating stance. "If you wanted to talk to Coldwell," Harlo said, "I wouldn't stop you. That's his business." He excused himself from the conversation. He walked toward the paddock. I followed him, which was either professional instinct or something else. I've chosen not to examine it too closely. Harlo Dean stopped at the paddock rail, 5 feet from where Ezra stood at the water trough. The horse was still drinking, that long, rhythmic pull at the water, and neither Harlo nor Ezra spoke for what felt like a full minute, but was probably less. Then Harlo said, without preamble, "You knew about the horse before you asked to try him, didn't you?" It wasn't a question. Ezra didn't answer immediately. He watched the horse drink. "I've seen his type before," he said finally. "Not him specifically, his type." "Where?" "Arizona, working for a man named Beaumont about 8 years back. Had a Grella mare same way, everybody'd given up on her." He paused. "Took me 4 months with that one. She turned into the best cutting horse Beaumont ever ran." Harlo considered this. What happened to her? Ezra's jaw moved slightly. "Beaumont sold her, good price." "After I'd gotten her there." The silence between them carried that information. Harlo's expression went through something. I was watching closely, and I couldn't fully name it. It was complicated in the way that sincere emotions are more complicated than performed ones. He looked at Ezra, and he looked at the horse, and he looked at his own hands on the fence rail. "Moody wants him," he said. "I know," Ezra said. "Lot of money, I imagine." Another silence. Then Harlo said with a carefulness that was new in him, a slowness as if he was choosing each word and meaning each one. "What would it take to keep you on? Permanent. Not day work, not seasonal, on staff with a proper wage." Ezra turned to look at him for the first time in the conversation. "And the horse," he said. Harlo held the look. "And the horse," he said. I wrote this exchange down as close to verbatim as I could manage. My hand was not entirely steady, not from cold. Ezra was quiet long enough that I thought he might say no. The possibility was real. I felt it standing there at the fence, the way you feel a genuine fork in something, the actual presence of contingency. He could have said no. He had the horse now legally by Harlo's own public word. He could have walked away from this ranch and taken Diablo Rojo somewhere else and built something from it on his own terms. He could have, and part of him, I think, was weighing that. Part of him was doing the accounting on what it would mean to stay in a place where he understood exactly what kind of place it was and what it required of him. He looked at Diablo Rojo, who had finished drinking and was standing now with his head low. One hip dropped, in the dozing posture that horses adopt when they feel genuinely safe. "All right," Ezra said. "We'll see how it goes." Not a declaration, not a handshake arrangement. We'll see how it goes. The most honest possible version of yes. Harlo nodded once. Then he said something that I've thought about many times since, something that was either a genuine statement or as close to an apology as a man like Harlo Dean could produce from the materials he had available. "I thought I was giving you a problem," he said. "I should have known the kind of man who'd step up for a problem horse." Ezra looked at him. His expression was not warm exactly, but it was open, the way a door is open. Neither inviting nor closed. "Most people don't know what they're giving when they give something," he said. He said it without accusation, just accurately. "That's not the worst thing a person can be." Harlo Dean was quiet. He nodded again, slower this time. Then he turned and walked back toward the house. I stayed at the fence for a while after. Moody and his people left about an hour later, Moody stopping to speak briefly with Ezra at the paddock gate. The conversation was short and civil, and ended with Moody offering a card and Ezra pocketing it without apparent urgency. Whatever was said between them, I didn't catch it, and I didn't position myself to catch it, because there are limits to what the evidence keeper needs to know. The other guests drifted off. The hands went back to work. The ordinary business of the ranch resumed around the edges of what had happened, the way ordinary business always does, pragmatically, without ceremony. I sat at the fence and wrote in my journal until the light began to fail. Diablo Rojo moved around the paddock at his own pace, unhurried, exploring its edges with the methodical interest of an animal newly comfortable in a space that had previously been simply contained in. He paused occasionally and looked toward the barn where Ezra had gone, and his ears were forward when he looked, and once he called, a low, single note, and was answered. I wrote for a long time, more than I usually write in a single sitting. I wrote about Ezra Coldwell and what I understood of him, which was not everything, but was more than I'd understood of most people I'd known longer. I wrote about the particular quality of competence that needs no performance, and about what it costs a man to possess that quality in a world that tends to reward the performance of competence over its substance. I wrote about the Beaumont Grulla mare and the 4 months of work and the sale that followed, and about what it says about a person that they are willing to do that work again, to build something carefully, with full knowledge of what the building requires, in a situation where they understand exactly what kind of place they're in. I wrote about Harlo Dean too, because he deserved to be written about accurately and not just as a foil. He was a man who'd done a thing publicly that he couldn't easily undo, and when the thing turned out to be worth more than he'd known, he'd had a choice, and the choice he'd made hadn't been the worst one available to him. It hadn't been the best one either, and I think Harlo knew that, but it had been real, which was something. The last thing I wrote before the light failed completely was not a note about any of the people. It was about the horse. Diablo Rojo, red roan stallion, 16 hands, 3 years at this ranch before today, characterized as dangerous, decided, unmanageable. Today he leaned into a brush. Today he walked a paddock without a fight. Today he answered when called. It is possible that the horse was always this horse, that what changed was not the animal but the human being in front of it. That decision, in the end, goes both ways, that Diablo Rojo had made his assessment of human beings and found them wanting, and then one human being had arrived who warranted a different assessment. This seems to me to be worth remembering. This seems to me to be exactly the kind of thing that gets forgotten. I closed the journal. I put it in my breast pocket. The ranch was quiet now, the deep, working quiet of a place settling into evening. Somewhere in the barn I could hear, faintly, the low, shapeless melody of a man who had forgotten anyone was listening. I walked to my truck in the last of the light. I did not look back. Some things you should just let exist behind you, carrying themselves, not needing to be confirmed.